Really pleased to be here tonight and a visitor with the Benson Center, and looking forward to talking about the research that I'm doing. And as way of backstory, I am going to talk a little bit about the evolution of my career, but also my thinking, because I think it's important to understand how I came to the ideas that I did and some of the background that gave rise to my thinking about these issues. So you'll notice I have up there democracy in the USSR. So the reason I put that up there is that I started out in graduate school hoping to be a Soviet comparativist. So I learned Russian and prepared myself to be a Sovietologist, which is what it was called in that time period. And I went to Moscow State University, with the intention of learning about how Russia and hopefully the Soviet Union was going to turn into a burgeoning democracy. So if you remember that time period, there was talk because of Gorbachev's discussion about democracy and democratic transitions. The hope was that it was going to turn into a flourishing democracy. When I arrived in Moscow, I realized after talking with a Russian family that took me in under their wing that democracy was very complicated to build, much less to sustain. And when I went back to continue on in my graduate studies, I realized that I also needed to understand not only what sustains a democracy in terms of ideals and culture and history, but also law. So for me, going to law school was kind of an extension of my research abroad, because I had been in the political science department, which looked at constitutional decision-making through the lens of modeling, and I felt like I didn't have a really good understanding of how law works. So I went to law school, taking a break from graduate school to do my field work in law school, and then came back to continue on and finish my political science degree, not in Sovietology, because of course the Soviet Union did fall. And that also meant the discipline in political science was kind of askew. And so I decided to pursue public law. So I was interested in public law. However, just to continue the story of the evolution, I did not want to, can I advance it this way? Sorry, thanks.
Just one.
Yeah, just one. I didn't want to be in a political science department because I now realized that interdisciplinary studies was more of my way of thinking, connected with what I believed about how ideas work. And so I ended up coming to University of Pittsburgh in a public policy school. And the reason I did that was because I hoped it would connect me in a research institution to different avenues of interdisciplinary research, like philosophy of science, like the School of Law. And that worked out great for me as a career change, but it also cultivated my thinking about technology. So when I was at the philosophy of science department, of course, they connected to philosophy of technology. And I ended up working with a group of engineers at WVU on a project involving biometric technology. This was after September 11th. And so the push was for national security, the war on terror, and the development of technologies that would further that agenda, or that hope that we could try to use some sort of surveillance technology or biometric identifiers to ensure greater national security at the time. And that caused my role in that project was to be sort of how do we adapt technology to rule of law? How do we preserve these principles of a democracy, like privacy, civil society, the way in which, we balance governmental power in the quest for national security with sustaining what's important to a democracy, which is civil society. So my role in the project was really to understand how those things connected, how the technology was going to intersect with Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, but also to do survey research on what people were thinking, how would they view the use of biometric technology. Right now, of course, we're all more familiar with biometric technology because you might use it to get into your phone or your computer or whatever it might be. But at the time, it was a scary technology for a lot of people, but so was the events of 9/11. So this was a really interesting opportunity for me to build the interdisciplinary perspective I had on not only democratic principles, but how technology could be used and adapted and integrated into a society. So that was my first foray into really thinking about interdisciplinary work with technology and democracy. And then, so, thank you. And so I transitioned into social media in part because at the time working with the engineers, we were also thinking about, how you identify terrorism and the like. And of course, social media and public source information was something that was suggested, but I was also interested in social media in the potential promise that it had, but also the potential downsides, the anti-democratic tendencies it had. If you remember in the Wayback Machine of social media, the hope was that social media was going to create a new interconnected society, global society. It was going to foster individual freedom. It was going to bring us all closer together. And of course, what happened was not exactly that. You started to see anti-democratic tendencies on the internet. You saw sexual harassment, cyberbullying, things that were, that were not what we expected, not what we intended with the rise of social media, which from my perspective, I started thinking about, given the work that I had done on technology and the intersection with society, thinking about, well, which came first? Did the technology create these anti-democratic tendencies, or were we creating them? How were the two interacting in a way to create these bad tendencies? And so this first book is really just more about what would be called like a post-phenomenological approach to technology, in looking at how technology influences us in ways that we might not even be aware, like judgments about time consciousness, causation and context, and how we view responsibility when we're online. So that was the first kind of the philosophical layer to the work that I'm currently doing now. So I've called it tentatively, I'm sure the editor will change my title, but the internet, how the internet made freedom into unfreedom. And the reason why I chose that title is because, again, in the beginning with the internet and the way that we thought about the internet, it was all about the prospects for freedom. And so we regulated it with that idea in mind. It was market regulation. It was liberty of contract so that it would create the most generativity. It was lack of government intervention so that private companies could flourish. All of the traditional thinking about what would create the best circumstances of freedom. So for me, knowing that background and what we had hoped for, why do we end up in a situation like we have today, where there's a prevalence of censorship, there's oversight on political dissent, there's the removal of content in an extremely escalating way, content and users, and clamping down on what this freedom, this forum for freedom used to be? Why do we have that, and where did it come from? And that's a concern for me, because I don't think our online lives are separate from our offline lives. I think hearing about censorship, knowing about it occurring, understanding when it happens online has an effect. I know it has an effect on me when I feel comfortable talking about things, and when I don't feel comfortable talking about things. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, not only I wouldn't post that online, but I'm not going to talk about it in the classroom either. So I think this online phenomena of censorship is really actually very detrimental, not only to the internet, but also to society in general, and especially if we're striving for a democratic society. So part of the book is just looking at how we got here and why. So again, how we got here and why is not that we haven't been here before. It was the first kind of brush at the topic, because of course, the United States in certain periods of time has been pushed to do censorship. And when I say pushed, I mean politically pushed, politically motivated times in World War I and World War II, where the Red Scare came into our thinking about what needed to be struck down or repressed in society. And that led, of course, into different forms of oppression in other movements. So whenever my thinking more generally is that whenever political dissent goes against a more predominant controlling ideology that's justifying political institutions, the inclination is to kind of to push back on the political dissent. So of course, the Red Scare was about communism and the communist influence, and that challenge the communist ideology had to our more market-oriented ideology. So today's a little bit different. So I'm not going to spend time talking about what I think the ideological dynamics of censorship are, though I think there are some interesting ones, but I'm going to talk more about why are we having censorship occur? What can we do about it? Because to me, I think it's a pressing problem that has to be dealt with. So of course, what's really different about this period of censorship is that the primary source of censorship is coming from private companies. What control do we have over private companies? Not a lot. So that element of freedom that we began with, liberty of contract, where the consumers were able to contract for their services with these companies, that doesn't give us a lot of control. Yes, we can leave the platform. That's always the answer, right? When you say, well, there's censorship occurring, well, just go to another platform. But we all know that if you go to another platform that's not as well populated as the one that you've been using and you've been kicked off of Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it might be, the other platform is not going to have all your friends and all the content that you want. So it's not the same. You can't just leave, because the internet has, and the companies that are the internet have grown gargantuan in size. And they're, Facebook is Instagram. And so there's not a lot of division between the different platforms. So overall, that means that the First Amendment is out here, where the First Amendment during the Red Scares was there to push back. People could push back, and they did. And it did give rise to a constitutional change in the way that we evaluated free speech. That would be another whole topic to discuss, but it did operate to protect political dissent, and it operated to protect unpopular views and unpopular ideologies. So now we don't have the First Amendment here in this situation, arguably, because the First Amendment only applies to governmental actions. So private companies are the internet. So when you say, well, it's censorship, the pushback is, well, it's private companies, they can do what they want. That's the end of the story, but I don't think it's the end of the story. So how did we get here is just a little bit of backdrop to it. So of course, you probably have heard of CDA, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. That is kind of been thrown a lot around a lot by, in politics and on news media. The interesting backstory that we don't really talk about is where the CDA came under constitutional scrutiny, which I think is a pivotal moment because it tells you a lot about the intentionality behind the CDA when it was passed and how the court did it. So the CDA, for the most part, was struck down because it dealt with obscenity and holding like the what they called, and I always do air quotes because it doesn't really make sense in today's vernacular, but it's internet service, internet computer services. So that was kind of the language, the awkward language that they used, that they weren't going to be held responsible for any content that came across their platform. And the reason they did that under Section 230 was to try to preserve some generativity so that they wouldn't be censoring, so that they would allow information to flow. So, but most of the CDA, except for Section 230, was devoted to limiting the availability of obscene material. So it was kind of in the era where the Supreme Court had stepped aside from regulating pornography and kind of pushed it back to the states to do it. And Congress was saying, well, we still need to try to regulate this internet for pornography and obscenity. And a unanimous Supreme Court said no, because that's a violation of the First Amendment. And also important to the First Amendment is the Section 230, the CDA, because we don't want internet service providers being the arbiters of knowledge. We want political diversity in the opinions that are on the internet. We don't want government involved. And so it was a very strong statement, unanimous court, about the importance of the CDA, not for censorship, but just the opposite, that these private companies were tasked with doing nothing but providing the platform. Now, there was a Good Samaritan provision, which is often brought up, which is very, it unfortunately says, and other things, offensive, but it was directed at the obscene material that the CDA had originally been directed at. And so the Good Samaritan provision is often used as kind of like, well, we get to do this because the CDA had carved this out for us. So after the CDA was, I've got one big slide that says immunity because that's the whole story. The immunity that's given to social media platforms has been upheld over and over again. Advance the slide. It has been interpreted broadly by the courts. In early cases, there were challenges immediately. This is like in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where you would have a circumstance. Xeron was a case involving death threats where the provider was AOL. This was after the bombings in Oklahoma, and his name was wrongly associated on an AOL platform with selling T-shirts with a message that was very, I guess, very, very controversial, but also just mean-spirited. And so his number was associated with this statement on T-shirts, and he got calls and death threats and all that. So he contacted AOL and said, please take this post down. And AOL kind of drug their feet and didn't want it, they didn't have to do it. And the court, he brought AOL to the court to try to get some remedy for this situation. And the court said this is exactly a kind of circumstance where we don't hold social media platforms or service providers responsible for the content. So they affirmed the immunity for AOL, despite the circumstances and without any considerations of what it had done to Xeron. Also in Drudge, the Drudge report had put in an erroneous defamatory story about Sidney Blumenthal. So the platform that was hosting that story, they wanted to try to sue the platform in addition to Drudge. So Drudge was being sued for defamation. They wanted to like corral the platform as well. And the court said, no, there's no liability. There's always immunity for these companies when they're providing that platform, that social media platform. There were a couple of cases involving websites that had put in like questionnaires for looking for roommates that was in violation of some of the Fair Housing Act protections, but that was like a little carve out of the immunity. A couple of other just emerging trends, and I'll just briefly talk about these. There's a lot to them, but there have been challenges where people who have lost family members in terrorist attacks, like in the Paris attacks, tried to bring cases against not only the terrorist organizations, but trying to loop in the social media platforms that had provided an opportunity for terrorist organizations to communicate and to organize. And the court has been very strict about the way it's interpreting the provisions of the CDA and granting immunity, not even when there's another statutory conflict. The new one that we don't really know anything about yet because it's just hitting the courts now is FOSTA, and that was something passed during the Trump administration. It was trying to hold websites responsible for sex trafficking ads and facilitation. There's one case where Twitter has actually been held accountable for some of its involvement in hosting an ad that portrayed children in an indecent video that it refused to take down. So Twitter is feeling some heat, but it's not clear yet whether FOSTA will make any inroads into the CDA. But that's not the end of the story. Where the First Amendment potentially finds a way in is looking at not only the values that we're losing as a result of how censorship is escalating, but how we need to try to bring the law back in. Because I think the law, especially when we're talking about balancing power, as what happened in the Red Scares or in the civil rights movement or in the Vietnam War protests, one of the ways that balance of political dissent was struck is by protecting First Amendment freedoms. So the First Amendment challenges, and you can move through that, is they've been made. So there's one that's been made unsuccessfully. So I'll tell you the bad news first and then tell you the potentially good news that is coming if you're worried about First Amendment freedoms. So the public forum argument is nothing new. it's not new to the internet, but it's been used in times where political dissent or minority viewpoints have been repressed by private organizations. So again, remember that the problem here is that the First Amendment still is here, but it can't apply to private organizations unless there's a way to get there. So one of the ways to get there is by saying if a private organization serves the purpose of a public forum. And here, to illustrate it, the best way is to think of like a company town, where the company town owns the businesses, it owns the restaurants, it owns all of the public facilities that would typically be part of more of the government-owned facilities. In these instances, when the private companies shut down Jehovah's Witnesses from proselytizing, which is what they would want to do as part of their religious faith, the Jehovah's Witness brought a case using the First Amendment, arguing that the private company town, even though it was private, it served a public function. And because it was the only game in town, because it was the only space in town, that they had an obligation to protect First Amendment freedoms, even if they were a private organization or private company. So that's an important caveat. So you start drawing analogies. So is the internet and the companies that control it a private town? Do they control the only game in town? Meaning the bigger they get, the more it's only the game in town, because it doesn't make sense to move off to a small platform. So this has some play, but the court has considered it. I mean, if you want to advance to YouTube. So PragerU has been the subject of censorship on YouTube, like explicit censorship, but also demonetizing, throttling traffic, things that damage the ability of them to compete in the marketplace. And PragerU brought this argument specifically to the court about the public forum, in addition to some more nuanced legal arguments. But the public forum argument was the big winner, potentially, because it would bring the First Amendment to bear on YouTube being then like the company town. And unfortunately, the bad news is that the court wasn't persuaded. This was 2017, so things move fastly or quickly on the internet. Things change quickly, meaning the bigger YouTube gets, or if there's fewer competitors, the more salient this argument gets. But so far, it hasn't hung, it hasn't caught, and so it's the bad news. But the good news potentially is the next one, which was coming up. So the analogy that I'm drawing here is to have you think back to the segregationist South. So this might seem like an awkward analogy, but if you think about it, part of what maintained segregation in the South, even after the passage of the 14th Amendment, was that private businesses and companies were sustaining it, right? The 14th Amendment had been passed by Congress, and it was designed, the most important or impactful part of it was to give equal protection under the law from the federal level so that they could work against discrimination at the state level. That worked great for educational institutions or those things controlled by the government. But what was maintaining, if you think about what you want to do as a person in society, you want to go out to eat, think about the COVID shutdowns, you want to go out to eat, you might want to travel. And if you don't know what restaurant you can eat or if you don't know where you can travel to, right, that's a constraint on a whole segment of society who can't have access to that civil society. So what happened is that there were clever people and clever lawyers, and they found ways to see entanglement. So where the government is entangled with private companies. So if you want to advance the next slide. So the entanglement doctrine is more known as the state action doctrine. So state action doctrine is the one. So what it means is that what happens is that the government, in ways big and small, you'll see it doesn't have to be a big entanglement. It can be kind of a very small connection. There were ways that the courts were persuaded that, in fact, the 14th Amendment should bear on private actors. And gradually it was a huge part of deconstructing the segregationist South using the 14th Amendment, not the First Amendment, but the 14th Amendment. So I even, going back to this more academic nomenclature, but Tushnet and Sunstein, who are, big in this, advocating for this approach to discrimination, were basically saying everything's state action. And by that, they mean like if everything, the state regulates almost everything in a way, even if it's not regulating, that's also a form of regulation. That's the way they thought about it. So they were trying to be persuasive in saying, we really need to bring the 14th Amendment in on everything to take away the discrimination that is occurring. So I'm kind of using that kind of argument, not that everything is state action, but that even when you're not regulating, we have to think about it as the state making choices not to intervene, which it's doing with censorship on the internet. So there's a couple of different theories, and I'm not going to take original credit for this, but they're ones that I'm putting together that are both legal strategies that are emerging and also legal strategies that could potentially be made. They're not drawing analogies to the segregation of South. I think that's kind of more of a rhetorical strategy that I think is a good one. But there's this, so the levels of state action can be attenuated or they can be direct. So the attenuated form is, well, the government actually created Communications Decency Act. It created the conditions of immunity. So it's behind this whole ability for private companies to censor, to engage in censorship. So this entanglement is not strong, but it's original. And without the CDA, there might be a whole different ballgame in play. So the actual creation of the CDA is a small level of entanglement that is already being used as part of the legal strategy to change or bring the First Amendment to bear in on these questions. There's also the more explicit case. There's a couple of cases out there involving government officials actually directly suggesting and pinpointing who should be removed and for what reasons. And so that's like really closely entangled. And then the question that underpins that is that if they're that closely intertwined, are these private companies really just more extensions of the government, in which case the First Amendment really needs to apply? So, as you know, some of what gave rise to an escalation of the wave of censorship is the banning of President Donald Trump for misinformation and incitement of violence surrounding the election. And that was a high profile one, but there were many small stories included in the complaint that was issued, the legal complaint that the Trump team brought forward. So there, it's no small number, 65,000 people who felt comfortable coming forward to tell their stories of how they have been censored. Since that point in time, I'm sure if I ask each and every one of you, you could point to maybe 10 instances of where YouTube has shut down something, or Facebook has censored something, or there's been a banner that suggests that it needs to be removed, or you're taken off of Twitter or a social platform entirely. And one of the things that they're trying to do is to try to say the CDA in and of itself, its own creation, is a form of entanglement that gives immunity that then should bring the First Amendment in as just a lever of trying to open up the space for political dissent, where the social media platforms are deciding there should be no dissent. So the direct involvement angle is 2 lawsuits allege direct government involvement in censorship on social media. This one is Rogan O'Handley. He's being represented by Harmeet Dillon, the Center for American Liberty. And this was, she's arguing and demonstrating with pretty solid evidence that there's direct coordination between the state and Twitter, trying to take down Rogan O'Handley for his commentary and also, I think was he, I guess he wasn't running. I don't know if he was running in a state selection, but in any event, they targeted him for removal, and she's able to show some of this connection where there's direct entanglement. Another one, and this is a super interesting case, he's representing himself pro se. calls himself Dr. Silva, and he was a candidate in a Massachusetts election, and there's an actual, he submitted with this lawsuit an election playbook. So the playbook was created by a couple of academic institutions about how to identify people for takedowns that the government was using as a strategy to try to eliminate not only him, but other potential political opponents, and on the basis of misinformation, but essentially also undermining their following, their political support. And so this is two interesting cases that are working their way up. I'm not sure to what extent they'll be successful at this point, but in any event, this is like a prime instance where the First Amendment would be an opportunity to kind of illustrate that it's not just a wall of private industry that makes these decisions unabated, that there is, if we are in a democracy, an opportunity for the First Amendment to carve out space for political dissent and opposition. So the future is now, meaning that it's happening now. It's also, the loss, I guess what really spurs my interest in this is that going back to the Russia story, that the part of what strikes me is what's happening now, and this may be my own internalized Russian experience, but there's a lack of comfort in discussing things, and I'm not just talking online. I'm talking about in the classroom, in the hallways, in businesses, and wherever it might be, with neighbors even. There's that kind of fear that you carry, and that was very palpable in Russia. It was a very scary feeling, not for me necessarily, although I guess I should have been more afraid, but for the family who had lived in that experience and knew what not to say, who not to talk to, and they were very high up in the Communist Party. So it's not something that's stops at communism, at the low level societal members. So for me, the feeling that we're starting to experience, or I'm experiencing and others are experiencing, of not being able to talk, not able to discuss, being afraid of losing your job or having somebody call you out for an opinion that you have, is a very, I think, a threatening quality that I don't think is separate from what's going on online. So again, the prominence with which it's happening to me almost seems, I don't know if it's deliberate, but it's growing. It's becoming more. You can almost identify. I think everybody can identify somebody who they know, and I don't mean like personally, but some person that is a spokesperson or some content that it's been eliminated, and that makes it very connected to what you do in your real life, in real time and space. I think we're carrying that censorship into real time and space. And again, that comes from just that connection between what's happening first. Is it technology or is it us? And I think in the space in between, the mediation in between, is where the loss is happening in both venues. So I think it's important not to just, I often hear this when I talk about this in my classroom, well, they're private companies and they can do what they want. And that's fine. And I always say, well, we did that in segregationist South too at first, and it wasn't fine, and it caused, it was harmful for people, it was harmful for us, and it's no less important to think about the First Amendment to us now. We are losing it bit by bit, I think, in the way that this is happening. And so I think it's really important to fight it legally, which is the only way I can think of, other than throwing a lot of money at the problem to build a new internet, which I'm not even sure is possible, but to fight it in a legal way, but also to understand why it's happening. I think just simply saying it's private companies and we don't have to worry about it just doesn't address the centrality of the loss of free speech and association, among other things, privacy, anonymity, that are kind of drifting away with our use of technology and our reliance on these companies to mediate the space for us, without a lot of pushback or control for the consumer. Oh, one more slide. So the last thing is just future research. Connected to this in a way, I'm part of a project that's just emerging now that is looking at, so this will seem counterintuitive based on what I just said. So a group of researchers have formed and identified me as a collaborator on a project called the Collaboratory Against Hate. So they are very worried about hate online, which I was like 5 years ago, that was my main concern, until I started realizing how the political winds can shift and can be used in a way detrimentally to the thing that we're trying to preserve. But in any event, I'm working on the role of online media in their agenda is to try to show how there is the advent of extremism and it's being perpetuated by online media. I'm more interested in whether or not it exists in our military institutions. I have some skepticism about that, just given my initial conversations with some of our partners, but we're going to try to show the empirical evidence if it exists and try to determine if there's an online component, if it exists. But that's kind of something, a new offshoot of what I'm doing, and builds on my concern with the politicization of political dissent, which I think is a potential problem with this project, but I'm part of it. Okay. Thank you.
I have the somewhat more difficult job than usual of taking questions from the audience and Zoom, since I have to look in different directions. But if you hold your hand up while I'm looking this way, then I will let you ask your question. But I'm going to start with one from Zoom because it's a foundational sort of question.
Okay.
Someone would like to know, would like you to define what you mean by censorship.
That's good. That's good. So I think it changes. It's been changing. I would, from an internet perspective, I think it can be identified by, I mean, in a basic level, content removal, deplatforming people. I even think an increasing invisible form of censorship is just algorithmic control on what shows up. I mean, on your search engine as opposed to what doesn't show up. And so I think censorship has varying different levels of presence, but I think it's pervasive in ways big and small. Like we can point to things that are big. Trump got kicked off of social media. Little ways, like I don't even know how my information is being censored, but I'm certain it is just by, I do experiments like creating different profiles and seeing what comes up first, in my profile versus another profile. So I think it's happening a lot, and I think it's just the decision by somebody else to throttle the information, to remove the information on the basis of categories that to me are problematic, just politically and philosophically, like it's misinformation, it's disinformation. For me, the First Amendment has got a fairly clear definition of when you censor or when you can stop somebody from speaking. And it's when harm and violence is imminent. It's causational. It's a very high standard to meet. And it was deliberate, because we had gone through a period of censorship for decades. And the court was very deliberate in Brandenburg versus Ohio. They took the worst thing possible, like the KKK, and said, you know what? You've got a right to have the rally. You've got a right to say what you're going to say, but you don't have the right to engage in violence. And they weren't. They were just having a rally. They said hurtful things. They said outlandish things. But when it came to protecting First Amendment freedoms, they chose that case because it was the hardest case to defend, which I think anything beyond that is encroaching on censorship.
But let me follow
Yes.
up on this. So suppose I were to go on Twitter, or somebody who actually mattered, or to go on Twitter with a bunch of followers and say, Twitter's a terrible platform. You follow me over to, I think Parler maybe is their little competitor at the moment. Surely if I'm Jack Dorsey, if I've got the name of the Twitter CEO right, surely I would say I can stop my employee, I can stop someone from posting things that drive people to the competition just for the same reasons as I could fire an employee for saying, don't take my.
Totally, for me, it's totally, as a lawyer, that's totally different. Like,
Isn't that content?
but you're an employee, right? So as, well, I guess, so if you're working for Twitter, so you're saying he works for Twitter and then he's,
No,
oh,
no, suppose I just
okay.
have 1 million followers. I had 1 million followers on Twitter and I'm just trying to,
but you
to
don't,
get them all
you don't work
to-
for Twitter?
no.
Oh,
just,
well then say what you want.
Okay.
So, yeah, no, I thought you said he worked for Twitter and then he was saying, move away from Twitter, but no. Yeah, no, I don't think that, I mean, I don't see any problem with that.
Good,
Right.
that was
Yeah,
that was my
right,
question.
no,
Sorry.
that's fine. No, go for it.
It seems to me that like a lot of the censorship stuff has become so partisan. Like
Yes.
I can't think of many cases, when you ask me to think of cases, where people on the left getting censored
Right.
by these platforms. I mean, it's a sort of interesting thing for a long time. The right sort of worried about encroaching government, but now it's encroaching sort of private sector that's
Super interesting, yeah.
that has taken up some kind of like political cause, at least in certainly the sort of elite sector
Yes.
of big tech and Silicon Valley and so forth. Do you have a sense of like what the proportion is? I mean, I could imagine like maybe some stuff around like Israel or like maybe there could be some things that some people like on the more further left might be upset about, but on the whole, it seems to me like 95 plus is like it's censorship of like sources on the right. Is that fair?
I would say, no, I can't say empirically, like I'm trying to build that database, because as you say, it's like, for a while I was like, oh, I've got a couple of cases, and now it's like everything is blown up. So I think empirically it is, and I'm just speculating, I would say, that tends to be the trend, which also informs makes me think more about that ideological component of censorship, where you've got this moment in our history where the powers that be and the institutions that reign fear the political pressure. And there's something going on here. It's not necessarily against the government, it's against a certain, as you mentioned, it's a certain dimension of leadership that is not governmental necessarily. I mean, now maybe cooperating more than less, but that it's a different sort of reign, political reign. Yeah, but I think there's definitely, there's an ideological component of it, but it's so unique in that it's driven by private companies, a particular class of private industry. Which also, I mean, just on your point, as you intuitively started with, is that should also make us start to question, what we're talking about when we're talking about market. Let the market fix it. Well, okay, but the market's doing it. So, we need to think about this. I think all the old paradigms. That's why I say, this beginning paradigm is not the now paradigm. There's some interesting things going on in this market system that I don't think that we've dealt with before, that are new. And you bring up the idea of unfreedom comes from a leftist critic during a capitalist height of phase. Marcuse, the idea of unfreedom was that while we thought we were living in freedom, we were living in repressive tolerance and unassailable facts, all of these things that were ideologically bound. And while we thought we were in a free society because it was market regulated and private industry and individual freedom, we were really being bound by an ideology. I think we're seeing those predictions on steroids now. So I think there's some really, it's a terrible time and a really interesting time.
I have a question, Dan. Yeah. Do you think it's real? I mean, you keep talking about censorship, but it's really about market power. Like the issue to me is really that consumers don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And the fixed cost of entry to generate competition on these social media networks is really high.
Right.
And consumers they don't have any options, and they don't own their data, they can't take their data with them.
Yeah.
So it's really about the market. We just don't have the institutions of the market right.
Right.
And I think if we could get that right, this whole idea of censorship would be less of an issue, because you can just move around and
Right.
Go to whatever platform you think you know, you like them. If they like you can say whatever you
No,
like.
ideally, I
Take your
think,
followers with you.
yeah, ideally, I think that is right on the money, but I don't know if we've gone too far down a certain road where, now, I didn't cover like antitrust and common carrier and all of that because that's beyond the scope of tonight, but yeah, there's antitrust potential and, you know, breaking up the companies or the monopolies that hasn't been successful yet. There's an opportunity, if there's enough money to throw at the problem, to create a competing source or platform. You know, but that doesn't solve some of what's already, some of the damage that's already been done, which I maybe seem too hyped up on that, but I do feel like there's damage that's been done to freedom of expression, freedom of association, and privacy. You mentioned data. I mean, I ask students in my class about their notions of privacy, and they're like, you know, or why do we need an anonymity? You know, things like that were foundational principles to our Constitution that have kind of in a decade or 2 decades have sort of slipped away. So I worry, I'm worried about the loss of that with free speech and association. And that's why I think for now, even starting to bring the First Amendment into discussion is an opportunity to have people think about, well, what are we doing? Because I think we're kind of waiting for the market to adjust, but I don't think we're not talking about a domestic market either anymore. We're talking about a global market, right? So these companies are playing to not us, you know, if they're building it for the domestic market, it's not playing to everybody because it doesn't have to. That's not where the market is. The market's different for the internet. It's lucrative. It's lucrative here, but it's lucrative in a global sense. So it's feeding that market interest too.
Turns out there's a sort of a follow-up from online,
Okay.
a bit of a follow-up, which is, well, the question was how hard it would be to break up tech monopolies like Facebook and Twitter and the like. But one could ask, I mean, do you see that as something that we ought to be consider?
I hesitate a little bit because I'm not real confident that so if we're going to break it up, it's pretty complicated to break up. You know, it's not like a railroad. It's got these connections to third parties and intermixing of data. So it's really hard to show them. This is why they've been having trouble. The state's attorney general have been trying to bring cases, antitrust cases, and they've run into difficulty because it is a complex market to dissect to say, well, they've got a monopoly. So they keep coming up short in demonstrating that. I mean, I think maybe it'll take some time and some clever lawyers to understand it. So it's possible. But again, I worry about the time frame. You know, I think we need to start at least talking about the fact that this is slipping away. You know, we've let privacy slip away. We've let anonymity slip away. We let this slip away, like free speech. I just like, what else, you know, what do you have then? You know? Yeah. Well, I'm not calling you. Sorry.
So I'm wondering, in the interdisciplinary world, if the characters who would be most important would be social psychologists who could help us know, well, wouldn't they have helped us if they were going to do that? When do words become violence? So incite to violence. I'm going to use this one terrible experience I had where I had a young person in a class who was having a kind of break, and I had to say, before I could do anything, I had to say he is a danger to himself and others. And I wasn't sure, so it was kind of a memorable day where I tried to wrestle with that. But so that was my day of just thinking, how are we to know when the words, which can be quite alarming words, but how do we know? And it seems like when there has been violence, the neighbors often say, oh, I never suspected, I never knew that. So I just feel like the social psychologists are the team members who are the most necessary in a disciplinary.
Yes. So that's why it's such a difficult, that's why it should be a difficult discussion. I mean, to the point that you had difficulty making that decision about constraining somebody's free will and choice. We're not having those difficult discussions anymore. We're not even having a discussion. It's just done and it's over. And, you know, then you walk around going, oh, so-and-so got kicked off or they got canceled because they said that. I'm not going to speak a word. You know, I know in my classroom, on pins and needles all the time. So I think that discussion about causation and who should be having it should be immense. Like,
Yeah.
we should all be talking about that because, I mean, the court set the standard in Brandenburg, and they've wrestled with it ever since, you know, but that's what you do, is you don't, I always think of the Leviathan, like the Leviathan maintains power with nominalism. You know, he says, this is what I mean, and this is how I enforce what I mean. It's perfect power, which is a really, really, really dangerous point to be at. So I think that wrestling with those really difficult questions are exactly what we should be doing. Who should do it? I'm not sure expertise is, I think expertise is part of it. You know, legal expertise, social psychology, cultural. I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to it, but my fear is that we're just not even, it's gone, right? Yeah.
There are some some people who are worried about unfettered, the kind of unfettered internet freedom that.
Oh, yeah.
that
I
you
was
seem
too,
to-
yeah.
So unfortunately, this question peters out halfway through. I think maybe somebody hit send, had a little itchy
Oh.
send finger here, but I think I can fill it out.
Okay.
So it says, it seems like unfettered internet freedom has two sides. One doesn't want jihadists to. Well, one could.
We're allowing
finish
that, but that's, yeah.
to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
doesn't want them to, but
Right.
presumably there are the things that if we were talking outside of tech
Mhm.
would count as, you know, would count as a criminal conspiracy or
Mhm.
something like that.
Right.
Then there are the things that if we were talking outside of the tech issue would count as things that we don't like, sorts of speech that we don't like, but according to the First Amendment is nevertheless protected.
Right.
So where are the fetters that you want to draw on social media sort of the same ones that we would draw if we were meeting to
I think, yeah, no, I totally understand, because again, my first book was in that mindset, like we've got all these terrible things happening and people were, you know, talking about, well, we got to shut this down and we've got to be careful because bad things happen online and sometimes then happen in real time and space as well. But I think, again, there's got to be some balance in discussion. I'm very uncomfortable. Like if it's unfettered freedom on the internet, that doesn't mean we're not pushing back at that speech or those things that are being said in some way. I mean, when you hear, like, to give you an example, the court has this great line, one person's vulgarity is another person's lyric. Like, some people will hear something or see something and it's something they will never want to see or hear again. Other people don't see it that way. In the debate, in the give and take of that the internet is, I think, I'm not saying that we can get there, but I'm more uncomfortable with some unaccountable institution that's increasingly powerful in all, and they're not getting increasingly powerful just online. They're increasingly powerful in a lot of things. And so I'm very uncomfortable with that level of power that's unaccountable to a populace, really, for making really discrete decisions and controlling what it is that we get to see on the internet, especially as we move more and more online. So I'm not saying it's going to be a happy place, a beautiful place where we all get along. We've never always got along, So but I do think power, wherever it exists, has to be pushed back upon. That just would be my answer, imperfect answer. But again, the perfect answer is the Leviathan, right? I say what it means, you say what I mean. So. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So my experience within academia, especially as an undergrad, it's not uncommon for people to argue against the basic principles of free speech and argue for censorship. Do you think that we're in danger of losing that value as a culture? And what would you say to some of these people who are arguing for censorship and against the principles of free speech?
Yeah, well, I would say the majority of academia is on the side of censorship right now, because I find myself, where I thought I was kind of in the mainstream, I'm now on the outside. So, and that's in the classroom with students, and it's with my colleagues, institutionally across the board, nationally and globally, even in some cases, if you talk about Europe and, censorship cultures. So I think it's, like I said, I think it's important to be able to talk about why, even in those things that you think, and I have students talk about, we should ban this group, they should not have any opportunity to even exist and don't have any opportunity to say anything that they say because it's misinformation, and I do the air quotes because you can call most anything misinformation if you do it right. And so I think though that point of shutting down completely anything that is complicated or disagreeable or potentially wrong, because there's a lot of things that are being said that are wrong that are presented as being right. It's like Alice in Wonderland in some instances when we're having conversations, but where the lines, I know where the lines are that can't be crossed, and students know in the classroom where the lines are that can't be crossed. And that just keeps building and building. And pretty soon, I think you're creating a new culture. Yes. And so I really worry that that's happening, and that's why I'm here today.
Could I add to that?
Yeah.
Issue. I mean, I think a lot of the censorship stuff is downstream from the crisis of the academy, that there's just such a total
Yes.
lack of like intellectual, political, moral diversity. And
Yes.
because the academy functions as a sort of status bestower
Yes.
into the elite sectors of society,
Yeah.
all the elite sort of power centers have been totally captured by a kind of what we call woke ideology.
Mhm.
That's it's like most people don't even believe this stuff, but it's like
You have to go along to get along.
sociologist Rob Henderson calls it luxury beliefs. We no longer flaunt to get our status. We don't flaunt so much because everyone has phones and all these sort of things. Capitalism has made these things more accessible. Rather, we flaunt these luxury beliefs.
Yes.
And that's a lot of what universities, and I have a very good university professor, that I think on the whole they do harm. I think they create this sort of classist
Yes.
culture where you have to line up on certain beliefs, and that's why you gotta shun the person who's to show you're on the side of the righteous. And I don't know, so that's why I say it's I don't know I don't know. It's just a sort of follow up on that to say that if you look at Twitter, it fosters this kind of elitism with you've got the blue check people, and it's a kind of it's the chattering class. It's
Yes.
people have all these views of the world because they're on Twitter,
Mhm.
and the Twitter mob is always this sort of wokest, classist kind of
Mhm.
I don't know. I think the situation's bleak. And
I
think the best thing we have is insofar as we have democracy,
Mhm.
it pushes back against that. You get enough people who are fed up with that.
Right.
And maybe they can't have influence over education. Maybe in some red states they defund, some of the universities.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I think it's I think the best hope is democracy,
Right.
more democracy.
Right. No, I do. I totally agree with you. And it's interesting. So the analogies, again, back to the USSR, is that the quickest way to protect yourself was to accuse somebody else. So, and it didn't matter, in the Stalin period and in the whole period of the Soviet Union, the best way is to say, well, they're a political enemy, or in the Stalin period, they were a kulak. It didn't matter if they were or not. You were the virtuous one because you were the one protecting, the community or the cohort or the kolkhoz or whatever you want to call it. And that happens in the classroom. I see it all the time. A student will say, in order to show that they are much more knowledgeable than those other people that they don't think exist in the university, they'll say, well, they have they engage in conspiracy theories, or they engage in misinformation, they did this. And it's not based on, if you were to press them and say, well, what is it? What's the real science then, or what's the real sequence of events. They couldn't give you that. You don't need to. You just need to distance yourself. It's a virtue, moral position that doesn't, it's not grounded in knowledge. And it's very much like what I experienced when I was in the Soviet Union or heard about, in the Soviet Union.
There is a question on online from Zoom on democracy. So why don't we segue to that? Someone asks if are we still able to consolidate or maintain the current form of our democracy, or do you anticipate a new model of democracy to emerge?
That's interesting. I've been thinking about that. Just in terms of, there's a lot of people arguing that we need to go back to a convention of the states and rethink the union, because there clearly people have dug in their heels about what should be done and how it should be done. Gosh, I worry that's where we're headed, because unless we start talking, I mean, it can be solved with simple, I think, some kind of principle that we all can agree upon, which I think we used to agree on certain philosophical principles and constitutional principles as being, well, maybe we didn't like the outcome, but we believed that there was a process that was legitimate and there were legal principles that we followed. And I think that's being really quickly eroded. And so I do worry. I don't know if we're headed there, but I do worry that if we don't regain course, that it can be, and it's not going to be pretty or, smooth. It's going to be awful if that happens.
We do have other questions online, but I'm sort of going back and forth.
Well, I would like to talk about historical analogies.
Yes.
Because that's my theoretical identification.
Yeah.
history, and they're slippery.
They
And
are.
So I just wondered if maybe what we should fight about is historical, and the nation at large, is historical analogies, because for many people that's an arcane, tedious kind of discussion, so
Yeah.
we can bring the temperature down with that.
Yeah.
But so I'm sitting here curious, thinking about, I think your 14th Amendment analogy and Southern segregation is very effective. And yet I'm now thinking about consumer boycotts and ways in which people have put pressure on private business. And so in the matter of my people, I'm thinking, yes, but not, historical analogies are really, they're difficult pets. They turn around and bite, and they do all kinds of things to you. So,
Right.
So I'm just
Right.
wondering how you were feeling. And again, I'm not saying that I thought, well, I'm not sure that's, I thought that was very effective.
Yeah.
But I just wonder if you should be more nervous about historical analogies.
Well, I think, I would go to the law. So I realized that the activism of that period gave rise to, so the 14th Amendment was, of course, passed post-Civil War society. So it was quite old before it became useful, in part because the court cramped its interpretation of the 14th Amendment. But when it became useful in like the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, meaning that now the court was saying, okay, let's go. We're going to use the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. We're going to desegregate, and we're going to move on institutions that are government and use the 14th Amendment to disassemble or try to begin the process of disassembling segregation. So the law, to me, yes, the activism was all part of that historical analogy, but the law is what turns a single voice into a force to be reckoned with. So those cases, I'm not talking about, Trump, I'm talking about the 65,000 people who wouldn't, but for this lawsuit, have an opportunity to have, nobody cares about those 65,000 people. They're off of platforms and people are like, well, so what? They had bad ideas anyway, but that is a cumulative effect over time. That's just 65,000 people in that, period of time. Surely since then we've had many, many more. So I think the law is different. I mean, they're connected to it's connected to activism, but it has a force, if we believe it has that force to actually bring foundational and institutional change that activism sometimes, especially in the case of the internet, where it's difficult to kind of, especially when it involves the loss of livelihood and cancel culture and all the things that cost you the things that you love, the law can be that bulwark against, that something that maybe activism can't achieve in moments where it's not effective.
This is a long question. It's a good one, but it is long and complex. So if you
Okay,
want me to repeat some of it,
Okay.
I'd be happy to. Isn't part of the problem here that social media platforms don't have clearly defined rules and regulations, in part because the government has been happy to use vagueness to shield themselves, and B, the platforms don't enforce their rules consistently? Wouldn't we fix many of our problems if we treated social media platforms as speech clubs, associations that need to be maximally clear about rules and enforcement?
Well, I would say, number one, that's happening to a certain extent. So if you go on Reddit, for instance, you're going to find your group, but they are also, even Reddit is saying some groups don't have business existing, they're being kicked off of the platform. So we have platforms in small associational groups have really specific rules, really specific moderation, but it still can feel and look like censorship to those people who are shunted off, and I think if the human value, I guess I go back to like, what is it that we're doing here? Like are we trying to achieve some protection of humanity, human freedom? And so if I go back to that like base level concern, even the people who are engaged in unpopular ideas, which can change, drastically depending on where you are historically or culturally or in a society, that there's some level of humanity that should be extended just as a component of humanity, so that I don't think having, to the point of the Leviathan, you can have super clear rules and still not constrain power. I mean, that almost, the clearer the rules, the greater the power. I mean, we tried that. It's almost laughable. We look back at the Supreme Court trying to define obscenity, and they spent decades, going through, well, maybe no, we'll know it when we see it. So I think the clearer the rules, the more, ironically, I think the dangerous it is, to the point of causation in imminence of violence. That's discussion. It's not, I say that's violence, you say it's not, who's more powerful. That's where you end the discussion. That's the way the Leviathan ends the discussion, is I say this and you say it too, and then we all get along just fine. So I don't think clearer rules, no, I would say exactly the opposite. I think it results in more concentration of power. Maybe when you're going to get kicked off, but it doesn't solve the humanity problem.
Thanks. Can you say more about how you see the disanalogies between tech and tech companies and traditional media companies, perhaps in the context of Hunter Biden's laptop?
Oh, interesting.
That
You mean
is
like the
to say-
coordination of the,
That
yeah.
is to say, it seems like, one doesn't know, but it looks like there was a New York Post story
Yes, right.
that was never denied by the Biden campaign. It
Right.
turns out to have been completely accurate.
Yeah.
that
Lots of things,
was-
right, that we're finding out.
That was coincidentally or not reported by other media outlets,
Right.
mainstream media outlets, and was also the subject of censorship in the broad sense by Twitter. So they deleted and deplatformed people who linked to the Post article. for
Exactly, right. Yes, so that goes to my point, is that it's not just about the internet, right? So we're talking about, this is where I find Marcuse so interesting, because it's about power and ideology. So where is the power? And you'll find the ideology. So I think the media companies are too, maybe building their power on the backs of tech, but also finding their power on the backs of tech or in coordination with tech. Similarly, the cases involving government cooperating with social media and or regular media, that's, to me, that's happening. There's no way to contest it because we clamp down on what potentially would ferret that out. If you get discussion on Twitter, or you get discussion saying, yeah, but what about this fact? What about that fact? We might have gotten to the point of realizing that there was some truth to this story much sooner. I maybe have said this to some of you have already talked to, but the difference between misinformation and information is 6 months, right? Sometimes it is proven, or maybe a year, but eventually you get, I'm not a big believer in like absolute truth. Like I believe I'm a kind of a Kuhnian in my thinking about evolution of knowledge and science, but so I think debate and deliberation and discussion, even if it's erroneous claims, can be contested with, and so I think the power is not just in the hands of big tech. I think to me, it's fascinating because there's a lot of interconnectedness that's happening that is resulting in the need for censorship. But the good news, so I feel glum too, but the good news to me is that it happens, I'm convinced, when the ideology is faltering. To your point, people are not happy. People are pushing back in the little ways that they can, even if I go into school every day and I'm like, I'm not going to back down today. I'm not going to cower about what I have to say. Well, I still do, but I'm trying not to do that. But so I think the censorship is a sign that the ideology that sustains the powerful institutions, and I'm talking government, but also private corporations that are involved in the interests of censorship, they're doing it because they're losing the control that the ideology gave them. And to the point that Marcuse was making, that there's a point where, and that's why we were afraid of communism. Communism was a mirror on some of the falterings of our ideology, right? It showed some of the shortcomings of what we were trying to achieve. And so that's why they were so afraid of it. So I think there's fear in censorship. That's
Thank
the
you.
good news.
We're out of time. I apologize to those of you whose questions couldn't be answered, but please join me in thanking Professor Nelson for staying with us.
Thank you. Thanks for advancing the slides. I don't know why I would probably not pushing the right button.